Hey everyone, so for today's lecture we're going to be looking at the Cold War home front. This is how the United States reacted inside the country and how they lived in a kind of a constant fear of World War III. So while the Cold War never became a full-fledged war with the Soviet Union, there were a lot of proxy wars fought, but there was also a fight against communism at home. Like any other major conflict, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Cold War required sacrifice and commitment at home. So even more than they did during World War II, Americans were convinced that the future of the country was in jeopardy. This is a constant fear. It's not like they're at war directly with Nazi Germany or with Imperial Japan. It is the idea that they are at war with a creeping evil that could take over the country. So you can see that in this depiction here. Is this tomorrow? You see the fear of nuclear war and communism, overtaking communist soldiers, overtaking Americans, strangling women. So people lived in fear that this was going to happen in the United States. So in particular, the United States was afraid of nuclear attack. Once the Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons in 1949, the idea that they could launch an attack on American soil and unleash the destruction of nuclear weapons was very fearful. So the government started a campaign of duck and cover. This was a public information campaign to inform the public about the dangers of a nuclear attack. They convinced the public that a Soviet military strike was imminent, that at any moment nuclear weapons could rain down, and that what you had to do was duck and cover. You can see the depiction here of Bert the turtle, ducks and covers. So you have to find shelter and get under something in case of a nuclear attack. So this fear of an imminent attack obviously led to paranoia. Think about that idea if you always thought that, hey, today could be the day that we get nuked. Today could be the day that the entire country is destroyed. And so you can see depictions of this here in Mummy. What happens to us if the bomb drops? This girl is concerned about the idea of nuclear war. And then you can see here kids preparing for nuclear war. It almost seems silly, but what they're doing is duck and covering. They're putting covers, sheets over top themselves in the hallway in case of a nuclear strike. I mean, you can see almost how unprepared that the country would be in the case of a nuclear strike. The government had other preparations. Here you can see spotters looking for an airstrike. So what they're looking for is nuclear warheads or airplanes. And then you have water stockpiles. The government stockpiled drinking water in the case of a nuclear attack underground. So they would have water in case the water was contaminated with radiation. So much like we have fire drills, active shooter drills today, civil defense drills occurred at schools. These were defense drills to plan in case of a nuclear attack. So what you did was duck and cover. You got under your desk, cover your head, in the idea of a nuclear attack. So think about that fear. Like we have fear today of school shootings, the fear of that time of the 1950s and 1960s was of a nuclear attack. Americans sought refuge at home. They figured that they had to prepare and be safe at home. So Americans built bomb shelters in their houses, preparing for nuclear war. These were bunkers underneath their house, lined in concrete, and usually filled with supplies. So the idea is that if there is a nuclear attack, you could go into your basement, into your bomb shelter, and ride out the attack. The idea of this is that it's almost up to yourself. The United States military is going to do as much as they can to protect you, but you also have to be protected from the idea of nuclear attack. So you can see here these women in a bomb shelter playing cards. You can also see here you can protect yourself from radioactivity fallout. So you get the facts, know what's happening. So you're going to educate yourself on the idea of nuclear war and what happens in the outcome of nuclear war. A large part of this fear, too, was the idea that there were spies, that there were operatives of the Soviet Union working in America to overthrow the government. So Americans were convinced that communist spies had infiltrated the United States. This was proven true in the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were convicted of espionage and sentenced to death for selling military secrets to the Soviet Union. So the organization that investigated spies and investigated the fear of communists within the United States was the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which was a committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. This committee had actually been set up in 1938 before World War II to kind of figure out enemy motives like Japanese Nazi motives within the United States, but it really took on the fight against communism in the 1940s. In particular, in 1947, the HUAC began investigating Hollywood to see if Hollywood directors, producers, screenwriters were communists, were trying to spread communist propaganda. And this led famously to the testimony of the Hollywood 10. The Hollywood 10 were 10 directors, speechwriters, and producers who refused to answer questions on communism. They went before the committee and said, we're not answering anything. And then one of the big parts of the HUAC was the accusations and trial of Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was accused of spying for the Soviet Union. He was a federal government employee, and basically someone came out and said, hey, he's a communist, he's working as a communist spy. He was tried. It was a hung jury. The jury was not able to find him guilty or innocent, and because of that, his trial was delayed, and eventually the statute of limitations wore out. But Hiss was never found guilty of being a communist spy, but he was also never acquitted either. The height of the communist fear, though, was led by Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was a senator who took advantage of American paranoia and spread lies about communist spies in America. He stated in front of the Senate in the 1950s that I have in my hands 57 cases of individuals who are card carrying of the Communist Party, basically saying that there are communists in the United States. We know it. I know who they are. We need to find these people and flush them out. So McCarthy's slogan was better dead than red. That is, red is the color associated with communism, with the Soviet Union, also with communist China. So he's saying that we'd rather be dead than red. Remember, that's kind of similar to give me liberty or give me death. But McCarthy went on the radio and said, today we are engaged in a final all-out battle between communists, atheism, and Christianity. The State Department is thoroughly infested with communists. So the idea here is that it is in an existential battle between the morality of the United States and communism, and at the State Department, these actors inside the government are infested with communists. There's communist spies everywhere. So McCarthy is spreading fear. This era is known as the era of McCarthyism. This fear of communism is known as McCarthyism. And these were really false accusations based on rumors or guilt by association. There was never any evidence of active communist members within the American government. However, 12,000 Americans lost their jobs after being accused of being communists or having a finger pointed at them. And so this is really the height of the communist paranoia, the communist fear in the United States. People thought that there were commies everywhere. Charlie Chaplin, the famous silent movie actor, was actually forced out of Hollywood after being accused of being a communist, of having communist leanings. And so the quote from people is, communists are everywhere, in factories, offices, butcher shops, on street corners, and each carries in himself the germs of death for society. So that these communists throughout the society are going to overthrow the American government. We have to be on full alert all the time. Hollywood movies begin to promote this idea of a battle between good and evil, a battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, that this is a epic battle. So Hollywood goes to war. You have movies like Better Red Than Dead. Movies such as The Hunt for Red October, which is a story of a Soviet submarine, or the movie I Married a Communist, which is feeding off that fear of communists inside the United States. You have movies like Red Dawn in the 1980s, which depicted a communist invasion of the United States and citizens of the United States fighting against these invaders. You have heroes like Rambo here pictured fighting communists in Vietnam. So the American ideal, muscle-bound missile launcher blowing up communists. So of course this all bleeds into politics. Cold War politics dominated elections, so foreign policy became an issue in every election. No candidate wanted to appear to be soft on communism. So you have depictions of this like Uncle Sam on the boat, the USA, floating through, but you see the iceberg of communism that could crash the entire ship. So you can see this tough on communism in John Kennedy's inaugural address. He said, the U.S. would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and success of liberty. What he is saying is that they are at battle with international communism. They're at battle with the Soviet Union, the Chinese, to fight the spread of communism. Kennedy made a call for personal sacrifice in this battle. He said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." The idea here is that you are going to have to step up, that in order to achieve victory in the Cold War, achieve victory against communism, that the citizens of the United States have to make sacrifices, have to step up. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s became president in a lot of ways on his hardline foreign policy against the Soviet Union. He was a Cold Warrior. He wanted to directly fight the Soviet Union. And so Reagan challenges the USSR. His famous speech, he says, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev." Mr. Gorbachev is Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the premier of the Soviet Union. And the wall he's talking about is the Berlin Wall. So he's directly challenging the Soviet Union, saying, "This is not right. Tear this down. We are standing for freedom." Millions of Americans answered the call during the Cold War. They felt impelled to go to war, to serve in the military. So millions of Americans responded to the call for service and sacrifice and joined the military during the Cold War years. Many of these soldiers gave the ultimate sacrifice for the country. Over 100,000 Americans died during the Cold War. These were in conflicts mainly in Korea and Vietnam, in which the United States was fighting the expansion of communism. But while the United States never directly went to war with the Soviet Union, there were proxy wars and 100,000 Americans died in fighting the Cold War. However, there was very little appreciation for what these Americans sacrificed. A lot of people disagreed with the war in Vietnam, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers who fought in Vietnam were given little appreciation because it was an unpopular war. So they were treated with hostility by a lot of Americans when they came back home. People would call them baby killers, said they were over there fighting an unjust war when they were just serving their country. Cold War paranoia and fear was only accelerated as a result of the Kennedy assassination. Strife and division over Vietnam became worse after the president was killed. So remember, Kennedy stands up to communism. He's assassinated in 1963. There are many fears that this is a communist plot, that this is a communist conspiracy within the government to get rid of Kennedy. And so this only creates more division within the United States, within the government. The Watergate scandal caused even more strife. So Richard Nixon resigns in 1973 as a result of the Watergate scandal. So his forced resignation from the presidency shocked the country and made many people bitter. So remember, they had been trusting their government. There's communists in our government. We're fighting the Cold War, but only to find out that there's actually corruption within our government that aren't communists. So this makes people doubt the government. And this kind of makes a lot of people bitter towards the federal government. So American soldiers were given some delayed recognition. Vietnam veterans finally received respect for their service in 1985, 10 years after the war ended. You could see that here with a parade for Vietnam soldiers. Basically, finally people realized that, hey, these men and women sacrificed for the country. They actually went to war when they were called. You might not agree with the war, you might not agree with how the war was fought, but that these people had made a sacrifice. So a final effect of the Cold War at home is that the United States entered a state where they're always at war. So you have to think from 1945 to 1991, the United States is at war. So while they're not directly fighting communism, directly fighting the Soviet Union, they are building up military power. They are constantly in a state of war, constantly getting ready for war. So you see this in the buildup of a military-industrial complex where there are federal contractors who are building military equipment. The government is buying those. We also see that in like the buildup of Northern Virginia with the Pentagon, with military bases throughout the world. So this is really after World War II, when the United States begins to spend billions upon billions of dollars every year on military power and maintain a fighting force all the time. So rather than in other wars where they built up to fight the war and then kind of built the military back down, the military is constantly at War preparation. And so this is a big change in the Cold War home front, and this has lasting effects on what we see today.